What can we say about Peter's 40th anniversary?
I think there are a lot of things we can say about the 40th anniversary of Peter. But the first thing to say is that 40 years for a professional association is actually a very long time. You know, you should measure these things in dog years, you know, multiplied by a factor of 5 or something. Because when you think about it, Peter grew out of the Australian Association for the Teachers of English when that association was about 8 years old. And Peter also was brought to life just a breath before the Carmel Report and just before the Schools Commission. So actually, in a professional sense, that's a very long time. 40 years is a long time to still have a position of prominence and leadership. And I think one of the things that is good about an event like this is to use it as an opportunity to think about how we can interpret that 40-year period and the changes and the continuities that we still see in front of us in terms of the teaching of English language and literacy in primary schools. And a good association, seems to me, always knows when and how to lead and when and how to follow, and when to caution and when to encourage and to be experimental. And I think on those criteria, certainly the Peter story stands up well on those counts.
So what was the state of English and literacy education and research around 1972?
There's lots of ways of answering that. One way is to recognise, when you go back and look at the professional and the research literature and the policies, that there is a very clear distinction between English and language and literacy education in 1972. They weren't particularly conjoined into, you know, a composite area of inquiry for researchers or a composite area of practice and policy development for educators. So that's the first thing to notice, I think, that's remarkable to us now, I think, looking back. We would think that. The second thing to say is that literacy education was, as a topic of inquiry and I think policy and probably practice as well, very much the study of reading and very much the study of how children learn to read in the first 4 or 5 years of school and before that, in preschool and in families. So that was a clear distinction. The study of writing and the focus on writing pedagogically or in policy really was very, very light, and it wasn't there in any real sense. So 1972 was that place as well. But even further, when we go and look at the issue of reading itself, what did reading research and reading practice and reading policy in education look like? And what we find is we are in the midst of what turned out to be a very long and not always very interesting debate that was characterised as the distinction between a phonics approach and a whole language approach. This was the debate that raged away from about the late 1960s and was in full cry when Peter came to life. And we still find it in some circles here and there that a phonics approach was also associated with direct teaching, with what we would now call teacher-centred practices, with a focus on the sounding out of words and letters, and only a gradual beginning in some cases, if you look at the Reading Research Quarterly, to think about how children might read what was called extended discourse or meaningful sentences even at that time. So the notion of text as a kind of the basic site of thinking about how children learn to read wasn't well developed. On the other hand, whole language coming out of humanistic psychology versus experimental psychology, being caught up in the sorts of movements that were growing out of Piagetian psychology, a focus on the child and the way the child learned naturally in natural settings and so on, characterising itself as more student-centred, more text-oriented and so on. So that was a debate that was in full cry and that I think has, in many circles, resolved itself around a richer solution, but that was very much the way it was. So we had the Australian Reading Association, formed in about 1975, and it didn't change its name to the Australian Literacy Educators Association, which it is now, for about 20 years. So it was in the mid-90s that we were starting to reconceptualise literacy education as well. So that's sort of the main features, it seems to me. There was a focus, if you look at the Reading Research Quarterly, particularly the review articles by Samuels and Williams, and they talk about the dominant themes such as word recognition, letter recognition, auditory recoding and so on, and the reading of words as the main features, and only a growing awareness in an interest in longer text as something that could be read. So it was a different world in that respect, but you can see how different disciplines were dealing with it in these ways. Now, this dichotomy between, let's call it phonics versus whole language, which tribalised the area and really led the lines of research and policy development for a long time, was handy in many respects because it simplified the debates. You just had to belong to somewhere, But also it gave a real boost to the ways in which commercial packages could badge themselves with respect to selling to a particular market. And the one important difference that we have to take serious account of over the last 40 years is the growing significance of the commercial market and packages, not just for parents, but also for schools and for entire systems to buy commercial products in reading and literacy and so on. That is a major difference between now and 40 years ago. They were there 40 years ago. They are now an extremely powerful force in the scene of English language and literacy education. Now, one of the groups, of course, that became uncomfortable with that was primary English teachers who knew that they had to prepare kids to deal with real text because part of primary English has been literature as well, and the use of good literature and so on, but also an understanding of the more fluid relationships among the subject areas in primary schools made them realise that what they were learning about their reading and writing was flowing through into other subject areas as well. So I think it was always a dichotomy that was a difficult one for primary teachers. But that was what was mainly happening with respect to literacy education. And when we turn our attention to English education, again, as a more distinct field then than it was now, what we see is the major effects of a conference that was held at Dartmouth College in 1966, still referred to by many English educators as a major landmark in English education. It had a major effect on the way in which English educators began to think about their subject area in schools, and as well brought with it a whole set of theories and understandings about the teaching of language and literacy as part of that baggage. And that effect can be described well by listening to the words of some of the people that were there and talking about what impact it had. And the best article here is by Angelotti and Allen, and they describe it in their words in this way. Here was a profession with a solid base, a clear direction. The personal growth of students would replace a slavish worship of text. Experiencing would replace parroting. Student-generated text would replace drills and skills. We can see that those dichotomies were paralleled, or at least echoed, in the debate between phonics and whole language, and that this was portrayed as a way of evolving into the next phase, very much a movement forward, a modern way of conceptualising English language and literature and literacy education. And a powerful set of ideas which gave the field a morally charged mission, as well as an intellectual base which was connecting up strongly with the humanistic psychology that started to become very, very powerful in what we think of as 1970s style progressivism in education. Now, for primary teachers, again, this gave them a powerful impetus to think about the ways in which literature was an integral part, the experiencing of literature and the production of literature, the writing of good texts by children in primary school as a core business, rather than, or at least as long, along with the teaching of the basics of literacy and reading and writing. So it had a very strong effect there, and PETAA was very responsive to this. It put out a number of books around the new English. This became a key kind of gathering point for English teachers. It set them apart to some extent from what was happening in the more curriculum-oriented secondary English education. It also set them apart from the Reading Association people with a focus on across the curriculum reading as well. It gave an identity, and it also was a serious professional niche for an organisation such as this to establish and to provide rich materials around these things that was not being met by the other kinds of associations at the time, and had direct parallels into what people started to become interested in with regard to research and policy and professional development.